we stay with Southeast Europe and to move on to the Western Balkans. I'm very happy to have one of our young economists who joined our institute more recently, Branimir Jovanovic. Previously was working in the finance ministry of North Macedonia and has PhDs from Britain. And we look forward to your talk on the heterogeneity of what we observe in the Western Balkans.
Thanks, Michael, for the kind introduction, and especially for that young. I'm not that young, by the way, but thanks. So, and thanks everybody else for staying this late. It's 5 o'clock, and I know how difficult it is for you to listen to talks such as this at this time of the day. Of course, it's the same. It would be the same with me. But I also have a difficult task to get your interest after all these excellent presentations today. But I have some good news, similar to Rumen. And the good news is that I'll try to be really short. I'll try to fit everything into 10 minutes. I don't have any bad news so far. Let's see how it goes. So the title of my presentation is Western Balkans lost between EU and EU. And it's kind of a word play of words. Yugoslavia, EU, the European Union. And just in the beginning, I want to stress that I will be talking about the ex-Yugoslav countries, ex-Yugoslav republics, who are commonly referred nowadays as Western Balkans. And these are the countries which are still not members of the European Union. So I won't be speaking about Croatia and Slovenia because they are part of the EU. And I won't be speaking about Albania, which is considered to be part of the Western Balkans, but was not part of Yugoslavia. And the dynamics there are slightly different. And I won't be speaking about Kosovo because Kosovo has also different dynamics, and it was part of Serbia until 2000s, early 2000s. So I will be speaking about North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I divided my talk into 5 parts, basically. So I'll start with the early 1990s. So what happened in the early 1990s? First, we had the breakup of Yugoslavia, of course, and we all know that. And then we also had wars in some parts of Yugoslavia, concretely in Bosnia and in Croatia. And we also had privatizations, big privatizations almost everywhere, which were very rapid, very quick, often premature, and over the night. And what are the outcomes of all these things? The first thing is that because of all this happening, we had a very strong increase in nationalism. Nationalism basically escalated, jumped overnight during this period. Then we also had very big corruption, very strong corruption, because first of all, in the countries which had wars, related to wars, because we have some people who are involved into wars, and they are corrupt, of course, and they are also powerful. But also in the countries which did not have wars directly, there was a corruption which was related to a privatization process, because basically the previous elites tried to get control of the companies overnight with the privatization. So that bred corruption. And this is just a figure which shows a control of corruption index of the World Bank in 1996. This is the earliest period in time on which we have comparable data on corruption for all these countries. And you can see the darker the color, let's say the pinkier the color is, the more corrupt the country is. So you can see basically that the Western Balkans and Eastern Europe are, let's say, more corrupt than Central Europe, or let's say Czechia, Visegrad, and the Baltics, for instance, and of course, also much more corrupt than Western Europe. So yes, corruption was really got very strong during this period. And what else did we had? We had also big increase in inequality. So until 1990 approximately, Yugoslavia, as all basically Eastern European countries, had relatively low inequality. Yugoslavia had, to be honest, a slightly higher inequality than everybody else for various reasons. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but still inequality was relatively low, especially compared to standards today. But in this period, the early 90s, it increased a lot in all these countries. And because of all this stuff, it also gave rise to strong elite, political and business elite, which was related to all this stuff, to the wars, to the privatization and everything, which were to all these developments going on. And this elite basically was very powerful. So how, as we move forward, let's say to the late 1990s, How are things going on afterwards? So what was happening after that, say, the initial period of establishment of these countries? After that, we had a very strong wave of neoliberalism. So we had very strong neoliberal policies in all these countries, which are often driven by the IMF. All these countries had arrangements with the IMF, several arrangements with the IMF. The only country from Eastern Europe that didn't have was Slovenia. Everybody else was having, and the IMF at that time was driven by this Washington consensus, as we all know. And because of that, they had very neoliberal policies, which mean that they were basically forced, or whatever you call it, to proceed with the privatizations, to go for the privatizations even more. And of course, this deregulation and liberalization philosophy, you had to deregulate markets, labor markets, product markets, whatever. And it led to establishment of monopolies, and it decreased workers' rights substantially. And of course, you had the policy of austerity and small government. So the size of the government shrank significantly, and governments basically had to pursue policies of austerity or cutting, let's say, public spending. And what are the outcomes of all these policies? First of all, from political point of view, the elites, which were basically established in the previous period, now are entrenched or got even more powerful. And from, let's say, economical, social point of view, we also had these policies of austerity and small governments led to very small, very low spending in terms of shares of GDP on education, healthcare, and all these other public goods. And of course, low investment in infrastructure. And because of that, we also had further increase in inequality. So I'll show a figure on inequality in these 4 countries. So you can see here how the income of the poorest 40% of the population and the richest 1% of the population evolved during the last 30 years in all these 4 countries. I can't really see the colors here, but you can see that one of the lines is declining. So the blue line is the income of the poorest 40% of the population. The other line, the orange line, is the one of the top 1% of the population. So you can see that they are basically a mirror image. The 40% is declining, the other one is decreasing. And basically what we can conclude from here, we can conclude several things, but the main thing is that all these years of, let's say, since the 1990s until roughly nowadays, maybe some years before, they were basically characterized by redistribution of income from the bottom 40% of the population, or let's say roughly the poor people, to the top 1% of the population, or roughly the rich people. There are other things that can be seen here. For instance, in Serbia and in Montenegro, the richest 1% have more than the poorest 40%. But okay, let's leave it for some other time. And then after that, we had the 2000s, which continued in some way with the previous developments, but we also had a new moment in the 2000s. And the new moment was that all these countries started their EU accession talks, their EU accession process. So what was different, or what was, let's say, symptomatic about the EU accession process of these countries? That it was different from the beginning of the accession process of all the other previously, let's say, socialist countries. Why? Because the Balkan countries, they had as a strict criterion for joining EU, resolution of their internal, or let's say regional political issues. So I don't know, Serbia had to resolve the issue with Kosovo, North Macedonia had to resolve the issue first with Greece, then with Bulgaria. For the other countries of Eastern Europe, you didn't have it as a strict condition. Now you have it as a strict condition. So it was a different process first. And second, the process was very, very slow, painfully slow, much slower than the other countries. So this is a table which shows how much time is taking, let's say, for the Balkan countries, Western Balkan countries, let's say, to even proceed with EU, not join EU. So North Macedonia, for instance, it's waiting more than 18 years. It applied 18 years ago to join the EU, and it still hasn't opened the accession talks 18 years after. The only country which waited so long for opening the accession talks is Turkey, and we all know what happened with Turkey. You can see the others. Bosnia and Herzegovina, which had a terrible war in the 90s, applied for membership, I don't know, 6 years or whatever. It's still even a candidate country. Ukraine became a country overnight, a couple of months ago. Bosnia and Herzegovina still hasn't done it, even though we had a similar war 30 years ago. So the EU accession process was very slow in the Balkans. And what was the outcome of that? First of all, it bred very strong frustration in the region. and very strong EU skepticism. I mean, very strong, relatively speaking, because looking at some measures, still EU skepticism in the Balkans is not that bad as maybe in some other places, but it's growing, it's definitely growing. Then it also strengthened nationalism, which is a big issue there. Then it also opened the space, the political space for an economic space for other big players, let's say, especially Russia, China maybe to some extent as well, but I want to stress Russia politically. And also it strengthened the corrupt elites even further. Why? Because now they can say that EU is our enemy. They don't want to accept us. I will protect you. You know, we are doing our best, but you know, we work in a very difficult condition, and it's basically strengthening the corrupt elites. I don't want to name anybody, but you can understand who I'm talking about in particular. And of course, the structural problems that I was mentioning before, like inequality, poverty, low investment in education, infrastructure, healthcare, and all public goods, they still remain. There is no improvement in anything of this. The story continues as before. And what's the future? The future looks very gloomy. I mean, I come from the Balkans, maybe that's part of my nature, but still I try to be as objective as possible. So what will happen? What's going on right now and what will happen in the future? So I think it's very clear now that the EU accession process of the region will remain very slow. We saw that a couple of months ago with the new summit. So Bosnia and Herzegovina still didn't get the candidate country status, even 6 years after applying. We didn't see any change in the methodology or in the accession process for Serbia and Montenegro, and North Macedonia got some, let's say, very, very diplomatically, let's say, way of starting the opening of the accession talks. But basically, in reality, it will remain closed in the corridor of joining EU for some time, because the conditions for moving forward are very difficult to implement right now in the country. So what will be the outcomes? The outcomes will be that the region will be pushed even more towards Russia nowadays. And I will show you a picture now. So this is in Macedonian, it's in Cyrillic, but I will tell you what it is about. This is an investigative story by one investigative journalist website in the country called Prisma. At the day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they analyzed which news stories got most likes and shares and comments on Facebook. And number one was the story that North Korea said that America is to blame for the war in Ukraine. Number two was a story that the Macedonian president said it's very worrisome that Russia has such a strong influence in the country, but that story was shared in a negative context. So what are you expecting? You know, how can you say this, something like that? And you can see the other stories. I don't want to spend too much time. The thing is that this is from North Macedonia, and North Macedonia is a country which is a member of NATO. And officially speaking, if you look at the parliament, you have only one party in the country which is openly pro-Russian, and the parliament has 120 MPs. Only 2 people of these 120 MPs are pro-Russian, so 2%, let's say, of the official representatives of the people in the country. But if you look at social media, which of course might be biased because of Russian bots and whatever, but still it's indicative. At least big part of the society, maybe not majority, but very, very big part of the society has this Russian, pro-Russian, let's say, attitude or sentiment. And that is all because of the wrong strategy of the EU for the region. So this slow accession process that the country is getting will further increase. Of course, it will push the region to Russia first, then it will further increase nationalism. Of course, it will also breed authoritarianism in some of the countries, especially in Serbia and maybe to some extent Montenegro, of course, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And EU skepticism will grow, of course. And the structural problems like education, healthcare, poverty, and inequality, they will all remain. Now, the big question for me is, can there be an alternative future? Yes, maybe this is science fiction, but yes, I think there can be still an alternative future. And that will be first, fast track EU accession for the region. Then second, until that gets done, give the region full access to EU budget. In that sense, the countries will get EU money. So this is a figure which shows you how much the current EU member states will get from next generation EU in terms of their share, in terms of their GDP. So you can see that Eastern Europe, Central Europe will get around between 3 to 5% of their GDP through next generation EU. As a comparison, Western Balkans will get less than 1% of their GDP through this European investment plan, or whatever it's called. So much less. If the Western Balkans were getting this amount of money, you can imagine what impact they would have on their infrastructure and public services and everything. And of course, not just throw money, but condition this new money that you're giving to the region with strict conditions for improvement on institutions like corruption, democracy, all this other stuff that I don't want to mention all of them. And what will be the outcomes? The outcomes will be that instead of pushing the region to Russia, you will hug the region away from Russia. You will hug the region towards EU. Then, of course, because of the new money that will flow into the countries, you will have big investment in infrastructure. You will have structural reforms because that will be conditioned with strict conditionality for reforms. And you will have growth of income, and you will have decrease in poverty and inequality. And of course, we have democratization because all these corrupt political elites will not have any more, let's say, scapegoat to blame for all their problems that they're making. So I spoke for 14 minutes, so slightly less than 10, but okay, I guess it's not too bad. Thanks.
Thank you for making up for my indiscipline here. Hannes.
Very briefly, thank you for the clarification. And I can only confirm when I visit the Dacia factory in Romania, they say they are the most profitable part of Renault. So, but my question, there's one small question to you. Did you look into R&D? Because when I visited Romania several times, they were quite eager in investing in R&D, much more than in Bulgaria. Maybe this is also a part of, at least for the future. But to both of you, there would be much to say, but we spoke a bit about corruption and the influence of corruption on investment, especially in the manufacturer sector. Does it have an influence, or can countries be very corrupt and they get good investment? Or is there any connection, or is there no connection at all, according to your impression?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Jovanovic. I have a question. You said that missing investment, etc., would bring the Western Balkans closer to Russia. Is there any? Do you have any knowledge about opinion polling in the recent years, and also especially after the Russian invasion? Because I could imagine that the sentiment quite changed after that, and that you would say, even though the European Union doesn't support us at the moment, we wouldn't really have positive opinions about Russia as well. Thanks.
Yes, yeah, that's fine. Go after.
So I have a question about the Western Balkans, and it's about scale questions. I've been doing a lot of work recently on El Salvador, and so I'm very interested in small countries in a big world, and does size matter? Are they too small to succeed, you know, as opposed to being too big to fail? And that's the trap they're into.
Thank you very much for the presentations. They were very interesting. My name is Nina. I'm from wiiw, and I'm colleague of Branimir, and I have a question for him. So why do you have a slightly pessimistic view on the Balkans so much, in terms of that there is a risk that in all these countries, and you mentioned Montenegro as well, there will be a rise of authoritarian kind of spirit?
Can't see. Oh, yes.
So I also have a question for Branimir, and given that we spent the previous couple of hours talking about the democratic backsliding and pro-Russian sentiments in Hungary, and democratic backsliding in Poland and Hungary, and the economic difficulties in Bulgaria and Romania, what makes you think that EU accession would have different effects in the Western Balkans?
More or less following this question, I think the EU is quite hesitant to further enlargement Western Balkans, because first you would need to reform the EU. You have unanimity in a lot of questions and a lot of worries about that some of the Western Balkans countries would block decisions in the EU because of some stuff. And then you also have a problem that if you do not solve the problems between countries, I still remember we had to lean heavily on Slovenia not to block Croatia. And if you talk with the Croatians and the Serbs, I'm a bit worried that we could have the same experience again. And so they have to solve their own problems. You cannot expect everything from the EU to solve it. You must solve it yourself. And you first have to have your own regional integration and show that you can do it. Probably you can have it outside of the EU, like what Macron proposed, or European Economic Area, huge investments in infrastructure and greening the economy with, for example, solar and wind power.
Let me add one question to both of you, sort of moving a bit more into the political science arena. Well, I always find it a bit striking that the flat tax regime and loss of transfers, why don't they develop into an unpopular position of governments, and why wouldn't it show up in electoral performance afterwards? And I think to Branimir, well, you spoke about this continuous strengthening of elite positions, yeah? This again, at some point one would think there would be some unpopularity emerging from that, yeah? Again, what's the political mechanism which prevents that to show up in electoral dynamic?
I think I had less questions, so maybe I'll start and then pass to Branimir to take the shocks. Well, I start with your question, Michael. I have been asking myself this question, and really I don't know the answer, but probably it's maybe the message that I was trying to convey is not so widely understood by the public, so that it could turn into a political agenda against the tax. But in the case, I don't know much about the situation in the Baltics, but in the case of Bulgaria, the business elite is strongly opposing any changes in the tax system. So, and it has been fiercely defending this tax. And every time anyone dares to suggest any change in the existing system, because the flat tax also applies to business taxation on tax on profit, they get a strong blow from the business elites. So again, it will be a difficult process, I guess. And coming back to Mr. Svoboda's question, I haven't seen the latest data, but the last I remember I saw that unfortunately both countries are still at the bottom of R&D spending. Romania obviously is doing much better in terms of business R&D investment, but regarding public R&D investment, both Bulgaria and Romania are lagging considerably behind the more advanced countries.
Thanks. I'll try to be brief. So the question about the pro-Russian stance after the invasion, I actually think that the pro-Russian stance has even got stronger for various reasons. But the most obvious one is that now people start to feel the consequences of, let's say, the war, like inflation and energy and everything. And they start to say, this is not our war. We should care about ourselves. Like it's much more important that we have what to eat than to interfere with what's going on over there, Russia, Ukraine, NATO, America, whatever. And because of that, they are, I would say the opposition towards the Ukraine is even getting stronger. There was one poll in Serbia a couple of months ago, maybe not too recent, but still very indicative, which showed that for the first time in the history of the country, and the poll was done by an agency which is not pro-Vucic, so it's pro-opposition, let's say, and it showed that for the first time in history probably, if there was a referendum for joining EU, majority of the people would vote against that. 51% at the poll said we would vote against joining EU if there's a referendum today. And the others were saying, you know, various answers. It happened for the first time. Yes, there's another indicator in the Balkan barometer, which got published in June or July, I'm not sure, which is published by this Regional Cooperation Council. For the first time in the last 10 years, the support for EU has declined. It's still strong, it's still 60%, but it has declined, I think, from 62 to 60, and it's for all the 6 countries. So there is already some data, some evidence in the data that, let's say, the EU support is declining and the pro-Russian support is even increasing. There's a question about the size of the countries. Yeah, I agree to some extent, but I mean, the Balkan countries are not so much different, let's say, from Croatia, from Slovenia, from the Baltic countries, from Czechia, Slovakia. The size is like that. Okay, Romania is bigger, Poland is bigger, but the others from the Central Eastern European region are not so big, are not even bigger. Serbia is 7.5 million or whatever, which is similar to, I don't know, to some of these countries, to Bulgaria. So I don't think that size is the problem. I think, I mean, of course, it has some consequences, but I don't think that's the main problem for the lack of development. There's a question about why I'm so negative about the Balkans and Montenegro, basically because of all these structural problems, like you have very high corruption, weak institutions, you have authoritarianism everywhere, you had internal political regional problems everywhere, you have low investment into education, into all these public goods that I mentioned, education, healthcare, and you have very high inequality and poverty. So basically you have many structural problems which stay there for years, for decades, and nobody's trying to address them. All the time you hear about, I don't know, you hear about policies trying to improve income of people and GDP and everything, but you don't have policies which try to address these deep structural problems, which in my opinion are very problematic. So that's the reason why I'm pessimistic. Until I see some concrete measures aimed at addressing these deep structural problems, I would remain pessimistic. There's a question about why let's say the EU accession process be different, let's say, for the Western Balkans. It's a good question, but I think that, you know, the difference is in the following: EU is throwing money, giving money to Hungary and Poland and all these other countries, but it doesn't require any reforms there. It's just giving them money, but requires nothing in return. Basically, just carrot, no stick. The strategy of EU towards the Balkans is the exact opposite. There's no carrots, it's just sticks. So just some conditions, whatever. Solve the issue with, I don't know, Bulgaria, Greece, Kosovo, Serbia, whatever, but you get nothing in return. You will get in 30 years when you get into the EU, but so far, you know, you have to work to get your money. So that's the difference. And what I'm suggesting would be different from what, let's say, Hungary and Poland are getting now, because I'm saying that there should be strict conditionality for getting the money. Yes, get these huge amounts of money, but with strong conditions. If you don't have these conditions, like reforms, whatever, rule of law, media, corruption, you don't get the money. What we have in Hungary and Poland is they get the money without any reforms. So that's the crucial difference. You will get the money in the Balkans, but with reforms. There is a question about, everything, why should we expect everything from the EU? Well, I'm not saying that EU is panacea. And when I was at the government, I was always telling, you know, I change my tone depending on who am I talking to. When I'm talking, let's say, to Macedonian policymakers, I criticize them. When I'm talking, let's say, to Europeans, I criticize Europe. And I think that's the right approach, because you should criticize both sides. But I'm not saying that EU is the panacea, and I'm not expecting everything, all the problems to be solved by the EU. What I'm expecting, or let's say requesting, is that the EU doesn't doesn't make obstacles, let's say, for the region. And what we have for now is just obstacles. It doesn't help in any way. It just makes additional problems. So that's the that's the thing that I don't want to see. I'm not saying that everything will change, you know, by the EU. Of course, domestic politicians have a big part for, let's say, for all the problems. But still, what I'm just asking is that the EU doesn't make additional problems or doesn't make obstacles for the region. And yeah, a very good question about the elites. So yeah, I actually think that there has been resistance to elites. So think about Serbia, for instance, Milosevic. There are protests against Milosevic. So basically, people toppled Milosevic down. But in Macedonia, similar with Gruevski, we toppled Gruevski down in some way. You can say even in Montenegro that something similarly happened last year or 2 years ago when these protests, which are okay, led by the church, pro-Serbian, whatever, but also to some part, people were fed up with Jovanovic and they basically changed the regime. But the problem is that even when you change the regime, let's say formally, there's no real change in the way of governing, in the political practice, let's say. So that's the real problem, that you just replace the politicians, the rulers, but you don't change the way of governing. So I think that's the real problem. And yeah, it also goes down, in my opinion, at least to the deepness or the deep roots that this way of ruling builds, pushes, with the age, because you have these politicians who are connected with businessmen and with all institutions. Like Cengiz was mentioning also this, the bureaucrats in Turkey, because they will try to prevent any changes. So in my opinion, it comes down to this, because you have entrenched not just the politicians who are in power, but very various and big part of other parts of the society who are very close to the regime, and because of that, they don't want to change the way of ruling. They want just to have someone else there in power, but not real change in the way of ruling. Thanks.